Hello. Today I have a pleasure to interview Dr. Matyáš Moravec. Matyáš holds a PhD from University of Cambridge and is currently a Gifford Fellow in Philosophy at the University of St. Andrews. His research interests include philosophy of religion and the history of late 19th and early 20th century philosophy. You can find a link to his website with a full list of his publications in the video description. Matyáš, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So I wanted to talk to you about your new book, which was recently published by Routledge.
Yeah.
The title of the book is Henri Bergson and the Philosophy of Religion. I will upload the first page of the book so you can see the cover. But before I start asking specific questions, let me congratulate you on this publication, because the book is very, very clear and well written, and the examples that you are using are very amusing usually. And even if you are not very familiar with the details of contemporary philosophy of time or philosophy of religion, Matyáš carefully explains everything that is necessary to understand stakes in the debates and various positions. So that's a great achievement. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, so the title of the book is Henri Bergson and the Philosophy of Religion, God, Freedom, and Duration. And perhaps it would be a good idea to start by telling us, in very general terms, what is your book about?
Right. So the general idea behind the book was to sort of bring together three groups of people, or three sort of strands of scholarship that have so far been quite sort of separate, or they haven't really engaged with each other. So the first group of people are people who work on Henri Bergson. Both that includes both sort of historians of philosophy who work on Bergson's philosophy within the historical context, as well as sort of contemporary Bergsonians who apply Bergson's philosophy to sort of contemporary problems. So that's the first strand of scholarship. The second strand of scholarship is contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. So as sort of analytic philosophy developed, even though sort of analytic philosophy initially rejected the idea of applying the methods of analysis to philosophical questions. From roughly the sort of 50s or 60s onwards, analytic philosophy of religion became a discipline of its own, and started tackling the classical problems of sort of in religion, using the methods of analytic philosophy or analytic methodology. And the problem in that strand that I focus on is the problem of divine eternity. So what is the relationship between God and time? So that's the second strand of scholarship. And the third strand of scholarship is sort of Thomism, or people who work on sort of Aquinas's philosophy, both within the historical context and in the contemporary context. And sort of these, if you think of these as sort of three different parts of a triangle that the book is trying to bring together, they haven't always been particularly friendly to each other. So the relationship between analytic philosophy and Thomism is notoriously very complicated, sort of through discussions about analytical Thomism. The relationship between sort of Thomism and Bergsonism is very complicated as well. For example, the whole discussion around Jacques Maritain. And obviously the relationship between Bergson and analytic philosophy is very complicated as well, mainly due to sort of Russell's rejection of Bergson's philosophy. And this book, basically what it tries to do is to try to use the problem of the relationship between freedom and divine eternity as a means to bring these three groups of people together, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in very short terms, what is the problem of the relationship between human freedom and divine eternity or divine foreknowledge?
So in really simple terms, the question is, how is it possible for God to know everything and for us to be free at the same time? So in really simple terms, so I mean, there are many sort of different levels of sophistication in which this problem can be articulated. But the really, really basic problem is this. If I say that tomorrow there are two options in terms of what I can have for breakfast. There's coffee and there's tea. Now, how is it possible for God? How is it possible? Okay, right. I choose one of these freely. Say I choose tea. How is it possible for God today to know that I'm going to have tea, but at the same time for my decision to be free? Right? It seems like if God knows now that I'm going to have tea, then it might not be possible for me to not have tea tomorrow, because that would make God's belief wrong, and God can be wrong about these sorts of things. So that's really the basic kind of problem here. How is it possible for us to be free, but at the same time for God to have knowledge of everything that we do?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you are trying to tackle this problem from the point of view that was inspired by Henri Bergson.
Yes.
And for someone who is familiar with analytic philosophy of religion or analytic philosophy of time, this name, Henri Bergson, may sound very distant, alien. And you write in the introduction that there is a tendency among many analytic philosophers to treat Bergson with suspicion. And you just dropped the name Bertrand Russell, so perhaps you can explain the roots of this suspicion towards Bergson, because there are some so-called continental philosophers that have much better press among analytic philosophers than Bergson. For example, Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm.
So how did it happen that Bergson became treated with such a suspicion?
So there are many sort of angles to the sort of many perspectives from which to look at the problem. It's very difficult to give sort of an answer to this that covers the whole issue. I guess one of the sort of side projects that this book is trying to tackle, as well as sort of some of my other research, is to rescue Bergson from being lumped together within the kind of school of continental philosophy. I mean, there are many reasons why I think this doesn't work. One of them is that it's really anachronistic. Second, if you kind of think of the methodology that is kind of stereotypically ascribed to analytic philosophy, things like interest in the philosophy of language or clarity of expression or empiricism, then Bergson ticks all of these boxes. There's I mean, if you on the one hand you list the key features of the analytic method, and then on the other hand you look at Bergson, it seems very difficult to not classify Bergson almost as an analytic philosopher, right? So why did he become associated with the continental tradition? I think one of the reasons is basically because he was so influential on several philosophers in the continental tradition, like Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, although there was kind of more of a negative reception there. But really the main reason, which I tackle in the first chapter of the book, is the huge influence that Bertrand Russell's article on the philosophy of Bergson, published at the beginning of the 20th century, had on Bergson's reception in the analytic tradition. So Russell's article is really horrible. I mean, it's very obvious that he sort of skimmed through bits of Bergson, but arguably because of the kind of maybe political influence that Russell had in academic philosophy in Britain at that time, as well as in the kind of formation of what was to become the analytic tradition, his rejection of Bergson was decisive, and had a sort of lasting influence on the way that people approached Bergson, and mainly people became suspicious of Bergson because Russell was really suspicious of Bergson, and because Russell was such a kind of towering figure of the analytic tradition at that point, he overshadowed other much more subtle and much more careful readings of Bergson that you find in Karen Costello or Susan Stebbing, actually. So Susan Stebbing wrote her master's dissertation on Bergson. So I think those are the main reasons. I think Bergson's influence on the analytic tradition, and Russell's, I guess Russell's kind of really unfair rejection of Bergson, and then it kind of took on. I mean, I should say, so Andreas Rahimis has a great book about this called Bergsonism and the History of Analytic Philosophy, where he tackles precisely these issues much better than I do in the book.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So a huge chunk of your book is devoted to philosophy of time.
Yeah.
Could you very quickly say why philosophy of time is important to tackle the problem of divine foreknowledge?
So yeah, you're completely right. So the book has sort of two parts, which to a certain extent can be treated well, not completely independently, but as sort of two separate issues. So the first half of the book just deals with Bergson and the philosophy of time. So there is no philosophy of religion there at all. The philosophy of religion comes in the second half of the book, where I look at the problem of divine eternity and human free will. In terms of the first one that deals with the philosophy of time, so one of the reasons why tackling the philosophy of time when dealing with questions about divine eternity and human free will is that the problem of divine eternity and human free will depends very, very heavily on the particular theory of time that you have. So just to give you an example, so earlier I said that suppose that God knows, suppose that the problem of divine eternity, of divine omniscience and human free will is generated by simultaneously trying to hold on to the claim that I can freely choose to have tea or not to have tea tomorrow, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the requirement for God to know which one of those I'm going to choose. Well, suppose that you have a theory of time that claims that the future doesn't exist. Well, in that case, my decision, me having tea tomorrow, or having coffee tomorrow, or me deciding to have tea tomorrow or have coffee tomorrow, these don't exist today at all. So the problem sort of dissolves. So if you have a theory of time that doesn't include, that claims that the future doesn't exist, then arguably, I mean, many people would agree with this, but some people might say, well, the problem just dissolves. There's no future. There's nothing for, there's nothing for God to know. I mean, similarly, if you have a particular theory of time where time doesn't pass, where time exists as a sort of a spatio-temporal block, where the transition from past sort of through present into the future is illusory, then you might say, well, maybe just God knows the entire temporal block and God's knowledge is actually situated outside of time. So in tackling the problem of divine eternity and human free will, the particular theory of time that you believe in has a knock-on effect on whether the problem can be resolved or whether it can be resolved, and what specific shape it actually takes in the articulation of the theory.
Okay, that's very interesting. So let me ask you a question about this first part of your book that is devoted to philosophy of time. There is this famous quote from Saint Augustine from his Confessions. What then is time if no one asks me? I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. And drawing on Bergson, you explain that there are two main ways in which we can speak of time. In a very short essay that was published on the topic of the experience of time during COVID that you have written, you said that time has two faces. Could you tell us what are these two faces?
So I mean, these can be sort of called by many different names. I think in the book, I refer to one of them as objective time and the other one as either subjective time or just duration, because that's the key.
Yes, or objective or spatialized time, and subjective time or duration,
yeah.
Or la durée.
Yes. So a really good example of this is to think of these in sort of two levels. So think of the following example. You're waiting at the dentist's office to have an appointment, to have a tooth pulled out or something of that sort. And you wait there for 30 minutes. So that in objective time, that's a fixed and very precise period of time. But that same objective period of time spent at a party or at a music concert or something feels a lot shorter, right? So the time spent waiting at the dentist's office subjectively feels like it drags for a really long time because you're nervous or you're bored. Whereas at the party, time just kind of flies by. Now, the general approach in analytic philosophy of time is to think of the kind of objective spatialized time, which is the time of the clock, which is measurable. It's divisible into equal segments. So the general tendency is to think of that as fundamental, and our subjective experience of that as secondary, as being maybe illusory, unreliable, but not not particularly having any significant metaphysical importance. Now, what's really interesting about Bergson's philosophy is that he flips this relationship around, right? So Bergson thinks that actual subjective experience of time is the experience that reveals the fundamental metaphysical nature of time. And this objective time or spatialized time, so the time of the clock that's divisible into segments that, you can represent it by a line, it runs in sort of one direction. There's a really clear difference between past, present, and future, etc., etc. So Bergson thinks that the second time, this objective time, is derivative and secondary. And I think that really is, for me, that really is this was really the starting point why I started thinking through this problem through Bergson's philosophy, because I think all of us kind of think of the objective time as being fundamental. Maybe if we're waiting in the dentist's office, our consciousness just can't be relied on. The way our kind of memories influence our experience of waiting in the dentist's office because we've been there before. That's all great, but fundamentally what matters is the objective time, whereas Bergson kind of flips this around.
You said that according to Bergson, the objective time is derivative, and la durée is what is basic or fundamental. Yeah. Can you say a few words about how is this objective time dependent upon the subjective time? What is the relation between them?
So that's a very complicated question. So I guess this is one of the sort of topics that I treat in, I think, the second or third chapter of the book, because Bergson's own view on this changes in the course of his career. And he so in the very first stage, in what I call stage 1 in the book, he believes that duration exists purely in consciousness. So in his time and free will, which is his sort of first major book, which I kind of identify with the first stage, presents what's a very heavily kind of Kantian view about time. So Bergson thinks, for example, that the sort of the subjective stream of mental states, that form the content of consciousness, is required for synthesis of different states of the external world. Here's this example of a pendulum swinging from side to side, where he claims, the only reason why I can see the movement of the pendulum is because we remember, our memory retains the previous positions of the pendulum, whereas in external objective time, these just exist as sort of discontinuous, unconnected features of reality. Now, this example with the pendulum actually never reappears in any of Bergson's books, because in the second stage, he starts defending a view where duration exists both in consciousness but also in external reality. So this is a good example with the color red that might look static to us, but actually, a particular wavelength of light that's kind of vibrating that inherently is motion, is movement. And then in the third stage, he starts defending a theory of time where there are sort of many different layers of duration that exist as sort of completely constituting reality. So this claim about and that the second stage roughly corresponds to matter and memory. The third stage corresponds to Bergson's creative evolution. I should also say that you find different categorizations of Bergson's development. So Deleuze in his Bergsonism has a slightly different qualification. But there is a general agreement that Bergson changes his views, that sort of duration starts to kind of move outwards, so to speak. Now, in the first stage that I use in the book, Bergson believes that sort of that time exists in consciousness and constitutes the objective time that is derivative, because there's just no time in the external reality. But he changes his views about that later.
Okay, thank you for this. So the claim that perhaps I found the most fascinating in your book was that time or temporally extended objects are constituted partially by humans and partially by God, according to a theory that you are developing. And So this theory, in a sense, is both idealist and theistic.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you can explain a little bit more how the existence of temporal objects, as temporal objects, depends on human subjects.
Right. So this is probably the most controversial claim of the book, I think. So in the book, I defend a version of, so maybe sort of going back to my response to the previous question. So in these sort of 3 stages that Bergson developed, I purposefully decided to just focus on Bergson's first stage. So I kind of tried to imagine what route Bergson's philosophy would have taken if he just decided to keep consciousness, if he decided to keep duration purely in the mind. Now, based on this, I kind of start developing. Okay, I start defending a view that might be called sort of partial. I mean, I call it partial idealism about time. So it's very clear that in Bergson's first stage, Bergson is not a realist about time, about duration. So he doesn't believe that sort of time, or I mean, the duration or time, which is derivative or depends on duration, that they can exist independently of the human mind. But at the same time, he's not an idealist, right? He doesn't believe that everything that's out there is completely constituted by the human mind. That, you know, if I see a particular object, that every single aspect of the object depends on the human mind. But what I think, and maybe this goes back to the example of the pendulum, which is really interesting, and which is at the same time kind of really radically different from what Bergson says in his subsequent books. You can think of the movement of the pendulum in the following way, right? So in order for the movement of the pendulum, this event, or this sort of temporally extended object of the movement to exist, sort of 2 things need to come together. One of them is the synthesis of the mind that produces the continuity of the movement. So this is a very heavily sort of Kantian position. And on the other hand, you know, the answer still needs to be, so there's still a question about where do these positions of the pendulum themselves come from before they are synthesized. What is it? So we know what's doing the synthesizing, it's consciousness, but what exactly is it that is being synthesized? And that's where I claim that what is being synthesized is sort of divinely provided being that exists in a completely non-temporal nature. So in order for an object to come together, you kind of need 2 things. You need a sort of divinely created being. I mean, this is kind of where I start building on Aquinas, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you need the synthesis of the human mind. And once both of these come together, you have a temporal object, which I mean, all of this this is something I say towards the end of the book. I mean, most of this could have really been done with various features of Kant. It's only in the second half of the book where Bergson connects this idea, or sort of my interpretation of Bergson connects this idea with the question about free will.
So this cooperation between the synthesizing activity of our mind and some divine activity reminded me very strongly of Bishop Berkeley.
Okay, yeah.
So did you have in mind Berkeley when you were writing this? Because
no.
Okay.
No, so no, because like I said, I do provide a sort of idealist reading of Bergson, but only in this sort of very, very small area. So I'm not claiming that Bergson is an idealist, and I don't provide a sort of an idealist interpretation of Bergson. I provide a partial idealist interpretation of Bergson. I'm just saying that, you know, like everything else comes from, I mean, you can either accept that it comes from God if you follow into the second half of the book, or you can provide your own theory of where the other being comes from. But the one thing that the book defends is that Bergson is an idealist about time and nothing else. Whereas I think Berkeley's view, I mean, I'm not an expert on Berkeley. He's much more radical about the sort of set of things that are constituted by the human mind, and I wouldn't want to do that. And I mean, Bergson himself didn't want to be seen as an idealist later. Yeah.
So let's call it local idealism or local anti-realism in modern parlance.
Yeah. I mean, I call it partial in the book, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned the divine activity in as constitutive, as partially constitutive of temporally extended objects. So can you say something more about this divine activity? What kind of activity it is? So God is creating objects as we perceive them?
So that's a really good question. I really so in the book I sort of offer three possible responses to how this might function. One response is just that we don't know, because the second one is also that we don't know, mainly because of sort of Kantian reasons about yeah, I mean, this is kind of fairly noumena phenomena type of response to the problem, that, you know, our access to reality is so kind of so inevitably temporal that we just can't say, you know, because God creates these things in a timeless fashion. Sort of the part of the object's being that is not temporal is timeless, and we just don't have any experience of why that might happen. The third reason why I think that we can't answer this question, and that kind of goes back to sort of the Aquinas type strand, so the second or the third strand of scholarship that the book is trying to bring together. And that's something that, so by kind of appealing to people like, I mean, mainly sort of Brian Shanley's reading of Aquinas has been incredibly, I mean, I don't know how happy he would be with my book, but his work has been tremendously influential on how I think about the book and the problem. And one of the sort of key insights that Shanley has in a series of papers from the 90s is that quite often in negotiating the relationship between God and time, there's this sort of tendency to think of sort of the temporal realm on the one hand, and then God on the other hand, and then just kind of trying to work out how they might relate together. So, well, I know is God, maybe reality is temporal and God is not, or maybe, you know, God exists in time but reality is not. You know, and you try to kind of provide some sort of cognitive relationship between how is it possible for God to know what happens in time. Now, Shanley, by appealing to Aquinas, and I think rightly, says that this is crazy, right? Because God is primarily a cause, sort of causation. He's the primary cause, right? The cause of why the temporal realm exists in the first place. And I think that's the thing that's being overlooked in many of the analytic discussions about the relationship between God and time. And I think but at the same time, because the causation of being, the causation of sort of giving being to things, is just the type of causation that we're not really familiar with. I think that is the reason why we can't really answer how it all happens. We can recognize once it's happened. So, I mean, an important feature of Bergson's philosophy is the distinction between sort of what happens in the present and how the present is retrospectively seen through the kind of. So, I mean, going back to my first, my answer to one of the early questions. So Bergson says that, you know, the kind of pure, the fundamental metaphysical experience of time only happens in the present. Once we kind of think back to the past gets contaminated through the objective time. But anyway, so we know that the synthesis is happening, but it's precisely because the type of causation that God is involved in causing essay and causing being is just a sort of causation that we're completely unfamiliar with. So it'd be very strange to kind of to step outside and have an experience or an image of how this kind of timeless causation of being can be provided.
Okay, this is fascinating. So we have different elements. We have the notion of subjective time. We have the notion of objective time. And we have this hypothesis that temporally extended objects are created partially by us and partially by God. And but in the subtitle of your book, God, Freedom, and Duration, there is also this word freedom, which is a very difficult word as anyone who knows the details of contemporary debates about human free will surely knows. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think analytic philosophers who discuss the nature of free will can learn from Bergson? Can you perhaps very briefly outline the main points of difference between Bergson's conceptions of freedom and the main assumptions of the contemporary debates on free will?
So that's something that sort of the second, so chapters 4 and 5 in the book deal with. And my aim in the second half of the book is both sort of destructive and constructive. The constructive bit is the one that I think is the more controversial one. The destructive bit, I'm fairly convinced I'm right about what I say in that part of the book. So what I do in the book is I identify sort of what I call four postulates of discussions about free will in analytic philosophy of religion. I should also say that, I mean, it might be possible that these postulates apply to free will discussions in analytic philosophy in general. But I think because sort of the landscape of contemporary discussions about free will in analytic philosophy is sort of absolutely massive, and it's really difficult to negotiate, and it's really difficult who's responding to whom, what exactly is the historical development of these different positions. In the book that's dealing with divine eternity, I just decided to limit myself to the types of views about free will that you find in analytic philosophy of religion. And what I do is I've identified what I call these four postulates, which are sort of fundamental or implicit beliefs about how free will should be negotiated. And then what I do is that I show that Bergson's philosophy can demonstrate that they're all false. So it's not the case that every single theory of free will in analytic philosophy of religion defends all of these, but every single free will theory in analytic philosophy of religion, I think, defends at least one of these. Well, and because Bergson shows that they're all wrong, that kind of really calls into question whether the theories that analytic philosophers of religion work with when it comes to free will are valid. So the first, I mean, I don't know if I'll get these in the right order, but so the first postulate, or one of the postulates, because I'm actually pretty sure I can't get them in the right order, is the belief that free will, the problem of free will is a sort of a general problem, that you don't need to look at sort of particular specific acts and ask whether they are free or whether they're not. But you can kind of put any sort of placeholder into the kind of free act that you're thinking about. So I mean, the usual shape that these questions take is sort of is it possible for subject S to be free, to perform a free act A or something like that. Whereas Bergson says that this is not how free will functions. I mean, free will for Bergson, I mean, there are some acts that are free and there are some acts that are not free. I mean, the decision to write Hamlet, or the kind of freedom that manifests itself in a creative process that an artist makes is just a completely it's a different type of act than the act of stopping at the red lights when you're driving a car. And Bergson thinks that you just can't lump these together. There are some acts that are more free than others. The second postulate is that the difference between freedom and determinism is absolute. So either acts are free or they aren't. But Bergson again rejects this. So he thinks there's a continuum, continuum between acts that are free and that are completely, absolutely free, and acts that are completely and absolutely determined. So for him, in every act, there's a kind of a mixture of determinism and free will. And I think it's something that's neglected in the analytic discussions about free will. The third postulate is that one's more technical. That's the belief that laws of causation, laws of causality, apply to consciousness. That the relationship between different states of consciousness, or in Bergson's case, between different sections of la durée, can be analyzed using the same methods that we apply to causality in the external world, and sort of either in the kind of necessitarian sense or in the Humean sense. And then there's a fourth postulate, which I can't remember now.
I believe this last postulate we are looking for is the principle of alternative possibilities.
Yes. So this is the this is the main one, really. Can't believe I've forgotten that one. So the principle of alternative possibilities Bergson's response to the principle of alternative possibilities is probably the most surprising feature of his philosophy. So the principle of alternative possibilities, or version of this, is kind of implicitly assumed by many versions of compatibilism that get used in contemporary discussions about free will in analytic philosophy. And the principle is it's fairly intuitive, right? It just says, in order for an act to be free, in order for you to perform a free act A, it must be possible for you not to perform that particular act. So the picture you get on compatibilism is a kind of a sort of a garden of forking paths picture of reality, where you come to a decision-making moment. There's sort of two or more options, and then it has to be equally possible, or at least it has to be possible for you to choose one or the other. Now, I mean, this seems fairly intuitive, but Bergson completely rejects this. So he thinks that this picture of free will that we get on kind of representing it through the principle of alternative possibilities only happens once the act has been taken, right? So he thinks that in what's happening in the decision-making process is, as he says there's just a single self which grows and develops by its very hesitation. So we kind of gradually oscillate between different tendencies in ourselves, and then one of the acts just kind of springs out of our personality. And then we choose it, and then once the choice has been taken, we look back at the past and realize, oh yeah, I guess I could have done something else. But for Bergson, at the very point when this decision is making place, these options don't actually exist. I mean, I know this sounds really, really counterintuitive. I mean, partially because we're, I'm not sure whether this is something that Bergson says, but it's definitely true that implicitly we're used to think of decision making in these terms. I think it's particularly relevant in in kind of contemporary the way that you use technology, kind of press yes no buttons and that kind of thing, and that really kind of contaminates the way that we think about free will. And Bergson thinks that once you go back to these like really, really genuinely free acts, with like in the acts involved in a creative process, then you don't kind of find this sort of stuff there at all. So yeah, so that's why Bergson rejects this principle altogether.
Okay, so we have discussed the nature of time according to Bergson. We have also tackled his approach to human freedom. And drawing on these elements, can you already point towards your own proposal about how to solve this problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom? How can we use those building blocks to offer some solution to this problem?
So that's something. So that's sort of something I discuss in the final chapter of the book. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I can reproduce the answer off the top of my head. So basically, one of the sort of key insights. So I mean, this is something I said earlier. So the response, the sort of application of Bergson's philosophy to free will discussions in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion has these two aspects. One of them is the destructive one, which is to show that these postulates that are universally or almost universally assumed, or at least one of them is universally assumed by contemporary theories of free will in analytic philosophy of religion, that those are false. So that's the kind of destructive project. And I try to offer a more constructive vision of how all of this comes together. And the solution there is kind of quite similar to the way that I think about the constitution of temporal objects. So I mean, what I'm trying to argue is that when we perform a particular free act, two things need to come together. One of them is the freedom in the Bergsonian sense, so the freedom generated by this kind of free creative activity of duration. And then the second thing, which is sort of divine being. So all of this, and basically, and then so that's the kind of general picture that I give. So you need on the one hand, you need God who provides being to the acts that we perform, and on the other hand, you need the actual freedom that you find in Bergson's duration for these acts to be free. And then basically, what the rest of the book does is to kind of neutralize. I mean, first of all, to clarify how this relates to primary and secondary causation in Thomism. And the second thing that it does, it tries to respond to the problem of occasionalism, right? That we just which is the worry that our that our acting is purely an occasion for God to act, and there's actually no kind of genuine sense of freedom there at all.
Thank you very much. This is great, and of course, anyone interested in this topic should read your book. I put the link in the video description. as well as links to other papers by Matyáš. Perhaps I could finish this interview by asking you a more general question about the relationship between so-called analytic and so-called continental philosophy. So your book is a great exercise in bringing together those two strands of contemporary philosophy, those two traditions. And what are the lessons that both traditions of doing philosophy can learn from each other? What can a continental philosopher bring to the table that an analytic philosopher cannot, and vice versa? Do you have any thoughts about this topic?
Wow, so that's a massive question. I would say there are three lessons to be learned from this. One of them, I think it's important to be open-minded. I mean, like I said sort of earlier, I think the skepticism of Bergson, about Bergson from analytic philosophers, is purely due to kind of very, very contingent historical factors. To a large extent, just to kind of political pressures on the formation of early analytic philosophy. But it doesn't mean that Bergson is not sort of worthwhile engaging with. The second lesson, I think it's again important to just read kind of thinkers that are classified as kind of continental thinkers as in their own right, without kind of thinking about how much they've been connected with the subsequent tradition. So like I said, most people think Bergson is a continental philosopher just because he appears much more frequently in the writings of continental philosophers than analytic philosophers. But that doesn't mean that he himself should be classified under that heading. If there even is such a thing as I'm very skeptical about there being such a thing as, I'm fairly convinced there's an analytic philosophy. I'm very skeptical about there being something like continental philosophy. So those are the two lessons. And I think the third lesson to be learned from this is that it's sometimes, so I mean, this is maybe one of the kind of, I guess, inevitable weaknesses of the book, that quite often in order to sort of bring these sort of different traditions together, you sometimes need to provide kind of slightly controversial interpretations of some of these thinkers. So I'm pretty sure that the sort of the picture of Bergson that I offer in the book is quite horrifying to Bergson scholars, because it's a hypothetical Bergsonism. It's sort of like what Bergson would have been had he not decided to kind of shift to the second stage of his philosophy. But I mean, primarily, I'm sort of really more than sort of obsessive, extreme historical contextualization and kind of taking Bergson as a kind of a single kind of it's sort of a figure with kind of fairly unified views about everything. I'm much more interested in kind of opening up dialogues between Bergson and other scholars, even if that sometimes comes at the cost of providing potentially quite controversial or sort of unorthodox readings of these thinkers, which applies to Aquinas as well. I think that's really the other thing that probably people are going to hate me for.
Yeah, I'm not a historian of philosophy, but I think that initially analytic philosophers were very skeptical of Kierkegaard as well.
Mm-hmm.
They treated him as a blanket irrationalist, someone who despises human reason and advocates for a blind leap of faith. And then he was sort of rehabilitated within the analytic philosophy of religion, and now I think he is as much popular as Aquinas, for example. There are many analytic philosophers of religion who read Kierkegaard and quote him and develop his theories. So I hope the same will happen with Bergson and perhaps other figures like Heidegger or Hamann, a little less known philosopher from the 19th century. Matyáš, thank you very much. This was fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
I know we have only scratched the surface, but I think you have presented a broad outline of your argument in your book. Once again, let me heartily recommend your book to anyone interested in the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of time, especially the problem of divine foreknowledge. Thank you and have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thanks.